Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending Marine Science Day. We're excited to have attendees from all over the world with us today. My name is Vanessa Strom, and I will be your host for this session. In this session, Grace Molino, a graduate student at VIMS, will be discussing ghost forests. After a short presentation, we will have a Q&A session in which Grace will answer your questions on the topic. Now I will turn it over to Grace.
Thank you, Vanessa. So, as she said, I'm going to be talking to you guys today a bit about ghost forests, what they are, how they form, and what they mean for coastal communities today. To start, we'll look at this image a bit closer. So on the left, you see open water that transitions into salt marsh, and then on the right, you'll see an upland forest. And in between these two ecosystems are these dead white trees. Some are in the marsh, some are adjacent to the forest. And this whole area is what's known as a ghost forest. So this is typically an area of transition between two ecosystems that is undergoing rapid change. And in this case, the rapid change is driven largely by sea level rise. And so this occurs in two stages. The first is as sea level rises, the tides begin to encroach higher and higher into the uplands. And so a coastal forest, which is normally dry year-round, begins to be inundated a few times throughout the year. So this image on the left is of an oak tree that's being inundated by a high tide. This is, in this case, occurring about 10 times a year. So not nearly as much as a salt marsh, which is inundated twice a day on the east coast of the US, but enough that it begins to cause serious changes in the ecosystem. And so in this image on the right, what you'll see is that the understory of this forest doesn't have any seedlings. There are no young pine trees remaining, and that's because they are very intolerant of salt water. So as the tides begin to inundate the area, they all die. And it doesn't kill the mature trees yet, which have a bit more tolerance to the salinity. But the understory changes, and instead those saplings are replaced by brushes and other shrubs. Then as this continues and the forest begins to be inundated more and more by high tides, even those shrubs can no longer survive the inundation from the saline waters, and instead they're replaced by marsh grasses, which you can see in this photo. And as the inundation continues to increase in frequency, some of the mature trees also begin to die. And so you can see some of these white barkless trees, which is what gives these areas their ghostly appearance. And this is also the stage in which the second step occurs. And so when you have extreme events in the area, such as a hurricane or a nor'easter, that commonly remove the canopy of the trees or blow over some of the trees, in a healthy upland forest, you would normally have a young sapling that grows up and replaces these older downed trees. However, in a changing ecosystem such as this, where there are no longer any saplings, the forest cannot regenerate after these extreme events. And so as it begins to die, it can no longer be replaced and eventually completely transforms into a salt marsh. And all that's left of what was once a healthy upland forest are some remaining dead trees and stumps. And so all of the photos I've been showing you so far have been in the Chesapeake Bay area. And while the Chesapeake Bay is somewhat of a poster child for ghost forest formation, this process is occurring up and down the North American Atlantic and Gulf coasts. This is an image from New Brunswick, Canada, of what was once a red spruce forest. You can see the remains of the stumps in the foreground and the white dead standing trees adjacent to the remains of the red spruce forest. This is an image from the opposite end of the continent, looking at the Florida Gulf Coast and the formation of ghost forests with palm trees. So the same process is occurring here, whereas sea level is rising, the tidal wetlands are encroaching further inland, and these palm trees can no longer withstand the saline inundation. And this is occurring everywhere in between these two images. So to orient you, this blue star is where VIMS is, where I'm currently located, and all the yellow circles are areas where ghost forests have been reported by citizen scientists. So if this is something you're interested in, and if you think there are ghost forests near you, you can go to the link on the bottom and report this. And there's a lab at George Washington University run by Karen Gadan, which is creating this map to help scientists figure out exactly where all the ghost forests are along the Atlantic coast. That link is quite long, so it has also been placed under the materials on the section of the platform where you entered this talk from. So now that we know a bit more about what ghost forests are and how they form, I want to talk more about what they mean for the coastal communities and what our lab is doing to study these changes. So I'll start with a quote from my advisor here at VIMS, Matt Kirwan. Ghost forests are the most striking visual indicator of climate change on the East Coast. Now, typically when we think of climate change, we think of melting glaciers. And on the East Coast here, we don't have any glaciers, but what we do have are these rapid changes in coastal ecosystems. And what remains are these ghost forests that show us exactly how much change has occurred and how rapidly this change is occurring. So I said that the formation of ghost forests is largely driven by sea level rise. Now, the rates of sea level rise in this region have been rapidly accelerating. So when colonists first came to the region, it was about 1 millimeter per year sea level rise. And after 1875, that tripled to about 3 millimeters per year. And it's actually even higher today and increasing. And so a master's student who was in the Kirwan lab looked at the rates of coastal forest retreat at 5 locations between the Chesapeake Bay and coastal North Carolina. And she did this by looking at sediment cores, historical maps, and aerial photographs. And she reconstructed retreat rates over the last 2,000 years. And what she found was that pre-1875, the coastal forests were retreating, but very slowly, about a foot per year. And post-1875, the rates doubled and in some cases increased by 14 times for an average of a 9-foot per year retreat that's currently occurring. And Natalie also looked at how much conversion has actually occurred with these rates of retreat. And so within the Chesapeake Bay, 100,000 acres of uplands have converted to marsh in the last 150 years. So that's 2/3 of all the current marshes in Chesapeake Bay that formed by this process, which is an immense amount of coastal change for the region and one that occurred relatively rapidly. And so this was where my work comes in. So now that we know how fast these coast forests were forming and where they formed in the past, I'm looking at where they're going to form in the future. So I looked at 4 different sea level rise scenarios and estimated what uplands would convert to salt marsh under each of these sea level rise scenarios. So the light gray is what's currently marsh. The yellow is where ghost forests would be under a 0.5 meter of sea level rise, all the way up to the navy blue, which is what would convert under 2 meters of sea level rise. And what this showed is that up to 1 to 7 times the amount of area that converted in the last 150 years will be converting under these sea level rise scenarios. And 2 to 3 of these scenarios were predicted to meet or exceed by 2100. That's only 80 years that we will see an immense amount of coastal change that is, like I said, 1 to 7 times what we saw in 150 years previously. Just to zoom in a little bit on one of these areas. So again, the blue star is where VIMS is located, and the light gray areas are what's currently marsh. So that yellow through navy blue is what's predicted to convert under the different sea level rise scenarios. And what's important to note is that you can see some roads on that map, and that's because this area is not uninhabited. The area that's predicted to convert is not entirely uninhabited coastal forests. There are people that live there. And so this change is going to have significant impact on coastal communities and is in fact already having this impact. This image on the left is of Gloucester County. It's a soybean field, I believe, and the green and red indicate where the crops are growing. The brown and white area is what's currently being inundated by sea level rise on a yearly basis. That white is actually salt, and the crops can no longer grow in that area, and every year that area expands. The image on the right is of a church in Dorchester County, Maryland, and that grass in the foreground is actually marsh grasses that are being mowed. So when this church was built, it was still in a dry upland area, and at some point in the near future, it's going to be sitting on area that is inundated twice a day with tides. And so part of what our lab is interested in is what this transition means for the coastal communities, but there are also a number of other people here at VIMS that are studying these impacts. And I want to end on this image and a positive note that while this transition does have significant consequences for coastal communities, it is also a sign of ecological resilience and hope for the region, because these coastal salt marshes are incredibly important for the local communities. They provide protection against flooding from storms, they improve water quality, and they provide habitat for important organisms to the community, such as juvenile blue crabs. And so the fact that they are able to migrate inland and maintain their extent means that they'll be able to continue to provide these services to coastal communities well into the next few decades. So with that, I'll be happy to take any questions that you might have.
All right, thank you so much, Grace, for that awesome presentation. So now we will start our Q&A session. I wanted to start off with one of my questions. So in your presentation, there was a graph that was showing marsh migration rates for North Carolina and the Chesapeake Bay. So can you explain how or like why the rates are different in different places?
Yeah, absolutely. So overall, these transitions are largely driven by sea level rise, but rates of sea level rise vary across the Atlantic coast. And so the Chesapeake Bay actually has the highest rates of sea level rise in North America. And that's because of a variety of factors, but that's why you see transition rates in the Chesapeake Bay that are so much higher than anywhere else, because we have this rapid sea level rise acceleration. And then there are, of course, other local factors that are occurring, such as how low sloping the area is. So the lower slope you have of the land, the easier it is to inundate that land with sea level rise. And so if you've ever been out on the coast of the Chesapeake Bay, it's very flat. There's a lot of area that can be inundated with sea level rise.
Okay, all right. Valerie wants to know, how long do you think it'll take for these ghost forests to take over coastal areas?
Yeah, so that's a neat question, and they actually are already taking over a lot of coastal areas. So it's one of those things that you don't see until you know that they're there, and then you see ghost forests everywhere. So there are enormous areas along the York River where we're located, up in Blackwater in Maryland, that are already converting. So they already are taking over these areas, but the rates that they will take over the area in the future are accelerating. And so you'll probably see huge areas of forest that will no longer be there within the next decade, 2 decades.
Mm-hmm. And you think that holds for the Gloucester and Yorktown area as well?
Yeah, I do. I was just out near the Catlett Islands, which are like a bit further upriver from us here at VIMS, and the scientists who have been going there for decades now say that the rate of change there is only accelerating. They don't think there'll be much forest left there after 10, 20 years. So yeah, it's pretty rapid change.
Yeah. What are some of the differences between animal habitats between the uplands and the wetlands?
Yeah, good question. So the wetlands have a lot of creatures that rely on the tides. They actually need to be flooded a couple times a day in order to survive. And they've adapted to survive those regular inundations, and it helps them. Whereas in the uplands, those are creatures of flora and fauna that can't survive at all from the tides. They require it to be relatively dry. But then what's very interesting is the difference in species that occur within the ghost forest. So there are some researchers at VIMS that are actually studying what organisms can live in this area of rapid change. So a lot of invertebrates, things that can move in and out, so that if you do have an inundation, they can get back up to the coastal forest. So it's very different. It's very neat to see. So yeah, there's a lot of people at VIMS that are studying the different creatures that live, especially in the salt marshes, the snails, the mussels, oysters. There are a lot of birds that nest in the marshes. So they all rely on those habitats, which is why it's important to know that they will still exist in the future.
Right, right. And this is kind of a segue question. Is there a benefit for upland forests over salt marsh for subsistence?
Great question. So both ecosystems provide services, but they differ depending on what your priority is. So the coastal forests provide, of course, timber, their habitat for creatures that are regularly hunted, deer, pheasant, other birds. But the coastal wetlands provide the habitat for a number of creatures that come in from the bay. So they might not live there year round. So like I said, the juvenile blue crabs that come in, there are other fish that come in and will spawn within the wetlands that then go back out into the bay or actually out into the Atlantic Ocean. So that's an important difference, is that you have a lot of these species that come live there just for part of the year. Another important difference is if you're considering coastal carbon. This is what my lab mate studies. So coastal forests store a lot of carbon in the actual trees themselves, but not a lot in the ground. Whereas salt marshes, because things are changing regularly and rapidly being buried, they store a lot of carbon below ground. And so there are a lot of researchers who are interested in understanding what the difference in carbon storage will be and what that means for climate change in the future. And so those two ecosystems have very different impacts on the carbon future of the area.
Okay. So did something happen in 1875 to cause the acceleration in sea level rise? I think they're referring to one of your slides that you had.
Yeah, so it wasn't anything specific in 1875 itself that caused that change. It was more that you began to see the effects of industrialization and the Industrial Revolution, which happened prior to then. So there's a bit of a lag between emissions and rising global temperatures, and then the increase in sea level rise from the melting of the glaciers and the ice caps. So it wasn't anything specifically in that date, but that's when the geologic record shows us that there was a rapid increase as a result of all those things that happened previously.
Okay, okay. And I think we have a clarification from the previous question about land subsidence in terms of the sinking land that we're seeing in this area. Yeah.
Okay. So they want to know how those two ecosystems are sinking differently.
Is there a benefit for upland forests versus salt marshes in terms of sinking land?
Okay. So I don't believe that either one is going to sink differently necessarily. However, salt marshes are very dynamic ecosystems, and so they get, with the tides, that brings in sediment, and then it gets trapped in the plants. And as they grow, they also add organic matter to the soil. And so the marshes, even though the land they're on is sinking, they can actually build up their land so that they don't drown, which is a really neat adaptation to sea level rise. And and subsidence worsens those rates of sea level rise as they're sinking while the water is moving. However, terrestrial forests don't really do that. They don't have that input of sediment from the tides, and the organic matter that they put in they don't build up. So in terms of subsidence, yeah, actually the marshes would be better in terms of reducing inundation.
Okay. So what are some of examples of extreme events that could potentially accelerate levels or rates of marsh migration?
Yeah, so in the Chesapeake Bay, every once in a while you'll get a very strong hurricane. So that's something, so such as Hurricane Isabel in 2003, that was a really big one. So that came right up the coast. You can also have nor'easters in the winter that aren't necessarily named storms, but they can cause a lot of flooding. Sometimes you just get a storm that comes up the coast and sits. This fall, we had one that just sat outside the Chesapeake Bay, and it wasn't even a named storm. It just like that pressure system sat out there and caused inland flooding that lasted for over a month. We were going to some of our sites and we couldn't get there until that system eventually moved out to sea, and then the water levels receded. So very different. Down in the Carolinas, sometimes you can have like fires that actually come through and clear the forest, and then like I said, if there's no saplings to replace it, those forests can't regenerate, so that will remove them. Although those not as common as the storms.
Grace, thank you so much for being here and helping us learn more about ghost forests. And thank you for joining us.